Welcome back. I'm Dr. Emily Helder, adoption researcher and clinical psychologist. I'm here with my students, Ava and Francie, and we're continuing to talk about the Stauffer case in relationship to adoption research. So our goal in this episode is to talk about parenting biological children and parenting adopted children, how that's the same, how that might be different, and again, relate that to adoption research. So Francie, why don't you give us the context a bit about how Micah approached the fact that she had both biological and an adopted child?
Yeah, so based on her videos, it was really interesting to kind of observe how she interacted with her biological children versus her adopted children. And in some ways, it was kind of blatantly obvious that it was very different. For example, they made a whole video and they kind of explained how they put Huxley to bed a few hours earlier than the rest of the children while they kind of stay up and watch TV with mom and dad because he takes up too much of their time throughout the day. And so they wanted to give the other children, the biological children, some special time at night. Another thing that they did was they would only take the bio kids on some vacations. Some of the bio kids were the same age as Huxley even, and yet they took them and not Huxley. Another thing that they did that was really kind of disturbing was just that they punished Huxley for sucking on his thumb. There are videos of him sucking on his thumb and it being duct taped down and them just kind of like reprimanding him. Yeah, in one post in a video, I believe, Micah posted a picture of her biological son and daughter sucking on their thumb, and they praised the bio children because they thought that it was the cutest thing ever. And one of her Instagram captions of a picture of her biological kid sucking on her thumb, she commented, "I hope that she never stops sucking on her thumb." In addition to this caption, she also made a few comments on the post.
Yeah, she talked about how her daughter doesn't do it in public, so it's fine, and that she's not worried about it, and that she actually said that she'd be sad when that stops because it's the first thing in her baby life that I fell in love with. And she said, "I don't want her to stop. I want her to do it in her own time, especially in her situation with living in a split home. I think it helps." And I just thought that was such an odd comment because this daughter is older than Huxley, and if it is a comfort thing, why can't her younger son, who's experienced his own traumas, suck on his thumb? And it's not that uncommon for 2 to 4-year-olds to suck on their thumb, and I think her daughter is now around 7 or so it was just an odd thing that she would be so against Huxley sucking his thumb that she would feel the need to duct tape it down and buy him thumb guards. I also thought it was kind of odd that she attributed that behavior of sucking his thumb when it was Huxley to acting up.
Yeah, I think it raises sort of this issue of like how we parent adopted children, how we parent bio children. I assessed this in one of the studies where I was looking at families who had adopted and following them over time and had them fill out a questionnaire about how they parented each child, either the same or different from each other. And kind of the main message from that data is that the adoptive parents were largely parenting all their kids in the same way. So there really was not, at least like when I looked at the full data set, a lot of differences that parents were reporting in their parenting approach. There were, of course, kind of individual variations in that. So like a couple people in my sample did talk about that. But I think that more relates to the fact that each child needs slightly different things from a parent, like a different approach based on the child's temperament. And that's true whether the child is a biological child or an adopted child. So yes, there's going to be some times where parents will use different approaches with different kids. That I think is typical and good parenting, but maybe not to the level of individual behavior like thumb sucking and having that kind of distinction. Yeah. Yeah. There's some more work too by Albert Lowe, who has a chapter in my book, the Routledge Handbook of Adoption, where he talks a lot about how adoptive parents think of their role as parents and how that relates to then family outcomes for the kids. And in general, his research finds that when parents acknowledge that there are differences between families formed only through biology and families formed through adoption, that acknowledgement of difference does create some greater empathy for the child on the part of the parent, and then more openness to communication about adoption. So families that deny that there's any difference between adoptive families and biological families tend to be more likely to close off that communication about adoption. It's kind of like with issues of race, where if people take a more colorblind approach to race, they're less likely to want to talk about some of the issues related to systemic racism. But at the same time, Albert's work does find that families that are insistent of difference, so there's maybe an overemphasis about that, this child is adopted and this is say if they're introducing their children, these are my kids and this is my adopted kid, right? That would be a problem when there's that sense that the child isn't fully integrated into the family, or maybe that the family is using adoption as a reason to explain family conflict that's there, right? So that wouldn't be a healthy approach, but finding that sort of middle ground of acknowledging that there's differences, communicating about them, can be valuable.
Myker herself actually was adopted. So her mother had her at a pretty young age and then remarried when she was 2. And she was raised by this man who was her father, but she had no knowledge since she was adopted by him at such a young age. That he wasn't her biological father. And she found out at 16 after her family just never mentioned it to her at all her entire life. And she said that it was actually really kind of traumatic for her and that it really impacted her teen years. Do you think this at all kind of influenced the way that she handled adoption with her son?
Yeah, those are really different circumstances, because she had that continuity with her biological mom, but also at the same time, that lack of knowledge about her biological father. So I can definitely see how that would be an important thing to process on her part prior to adopting. Yeah, it's hard to say how that, played a role in this, in the adoption dissolution, but yes, it is true in the past, especially in the 50s through 70s or so, that adoption was generally fairly secretive. So most adoption was infant adoption, and sometimes people weren't told that they were adopted until they were older. So that is a past practice, but doesn't generally, it's not something that's currently done or recommended. Yeah.
Kind of going back to Albert Lowe's work on acknowledging the differences between adoptive families and biological families, I think personally, I've had a lot of adopted friends that kind of just don't even acknowledge it, try their best, especially growing up as a minority international student or international adoptee. They just kind of bury their adoption story as kind of, I don't know, because nobody really wants to be different growing up, and everyone just kind of wants to fit in. And I think that there's some shame kind of attributed or connected to their adoption. So do you think that in this case where a child feels like this, parents should be very kind of focused or make the effort to normalize it for them? Or do you think that they should just kind of take it as the child is willing? Or do you think it kind of depends?
follow their lead or whatever. Yeah. So what you're describing is a very common part of the developmental process of identity development and that kind of thing. So yeah, I would say I commonly hear that, and that's described in the literature, that sort of sensation of, I don't want to be different. I want to be like everybody else. That's just a common part of like adolescence in general. You don't want to stand out in ways that make you look different. So at the same time, I would encourage parents to continue to mention that those lines of communication are open. So even if the child is not, or the teen is not bringing those ideas up, that it's likely that they're still internally processing and thinking about, the relevance of their adoption to their kind of personal narrative. And so if the parents can periodically say like, hey, I noticed you haven't been bringing this up, and I'm wondering how you're feeling about that. If you don't want to talk about it, that's fine, but just know I'm here, to talk about that if you want to. So those giving those sort of openings in conversation. And then the other thing I'd recommend is facilitating opportunities so that adoptees can be with other adoptees, so that they don't feel like the only one. And that's especially true for transracial adoptees. Mm-hmm.
Do you think that there's sort of truth to the ideology that parents will love or feel more connected to their biological children, or those that they refer to as their own, as compared to children that are adopted?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that's real consistent either with the literature or with what I've seen in my clinical practice. So it's very normal for parents to have different kinds of relationships with each of their kids, whether they're bio or adopted. Like there's different things you have in common with different children, and so you do different activities together. That's all normal and I think healthy. But what adoption is most often characterized by this relational permanence, meaning this is my child, whether I birthed them or not. I see them as my child, that claiming. And the majority of adoptions have that relational permanence. So no, I wouldn't say that there's a difference in the level of love or connection. It might be that the parent and the child connect on different things, but that's not necessarily specific to adoption. Mm-hmm.
As I was doing some more research on kind of reaction videos to the Stauffer situation, I came across another YouTuber who actually personally knows the Stauffers and has an internationally adopted son with special needs. She created a video titling it, "Why I Would Never Give Up My Adopted Special Needs Son." And she's actually a little bit more famous than the Stauffers. And in her video, she explained that her son, Hampton, is different than Huxley in the sense that Hampton did not come from trauma. We got him at 3 days old. He did not experience trauma. So it's kind of this idea that the age of a child being adopted, because he was adopted at 3 days old, and she's kind of explaining that he didn't experience any trauma. So she's just kind of, it seems like she's saying that because they adopted him at 3 days old, that made him even more a part of the family and made it even easier for him to like kind of get over his adoption and like abandonment. So I guess one of my questions about this situation is, why doesn't immediate adoption necessarily like fix attachment issues in adoptees?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I always caution parents that while we form attachments often early in life, that like the implications of attachment and the way that we navigate relationships is really a lifelong process. And so people are adopted persons that I've interacted with, and the literature says this too, they process things differently at different ages. So really it's a lifespan process. So even in, kids adopted from birth or shortly after birth are going to process aspects of their adoption throughout their life. And there's the the trauma of separation from a birth mom and birth parents, and sort of maybe the sensations of abandonment and the loss and the grief that go with that happens regardless of how old the child is when that separation happens. You know, obviously the circumstances of that separation are going to impact how people feel, how they process that, but it's really a lifelong process. And especially as people get older, you know, it's really not until kids enter like middle childhood, adolescence, where they can really start to understand some aspects of their adoption story in a way that they might experience more loss and grief at that point, you know, even relative to early childhood. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So much that we could kind of keep talking about with this, but I think this was helpful in kind of understanding the various differences of parenting biological and adopted children and the experience of those biological and adopted children being parented. Well, next, let's talking about adoption competent clinicians. So stay tuned. We'll hit that in the next episode.